A heavy iron stamp comes down on a piece of paper, the red ink bleeding through the parchment. Cancelled. It is 1864, and with that single bureaucratic motion, an entire financial reality is quietly put to death. The paper wasn't counterfeit. It wasn't fraudulent. It was a local banknote backed by 100 bushels of winter, wheat sitting in an Ohio granary. It was real wealth, tied to real labor, holding real value. And suddenly, by decree of men hundreds of miles away, it was utterly worthless. There's a version of American economic history they teach in schools. It's clean, it's linear. It goes something like this. We were chaotic, we were disorganized, we had too many currencies, too many competing interests. And then wise men in Washington brought order, federal order, standardized money, progress. That's the version. But the deeper I looked into the financial legislation of the 1860s and 1870s, the more I kept running into the same unsettling details. The national banking acts didn't just organize money. They taxed locally issued asset-backed currency out of existence, quietly, relentlessly, until it was no longer viable. They systematically destroyed a system where money was tied to the physical world, replacing it with a system where money was tied to institutional debt. And they didn't do it alone. This raises a simple but critical question. Why did nearly every major industrial power on Earth, within a single 30-year window, secretly agree to erase the exact same kind of money from human history? Before the National Banking Act, the United States operated under what historians blandly call the free banking era, stretching from roughly 1837 to 1863. The name, I think, is deliberately misleading. It paints a picture of lawlessness, of wild men in the woods printing paper out of thin air. The official narrative tells us it was a time of wildcat banking, a fraudulent nightmare where banks appeared in the wilderness and disappeared overnight. And yes, that happened. I'm not pretending it didn't. But when you look closer, when you actually dust off the ledgers that survived the purge, you find something far more interesting. You find locality. Individual states chartered their own banks. Those banks issued their own currency, and here is the part that matters most, the part that gets glossed over in every standard economic textbook in the Western world. Much of that currency was backed by something real: land, commodities, warehouse receipts, agricultural assets, actual tangible wealth that existed in the physical world. Imagine you are a farmer in Ohio in 1850. You could walk into a locally chartered bank, present your land deed or your stored grain, and receive currency, reflecting the exact value of that asset. You weren't begging for credit from a distant institution. You weren't taking on a loan that would compound with interest until it swallowed your farm. You were, in a very real, literal sense, monetizing your own productive capacity. The money existed because the wheat existed. No intermediary was required to determine whether the wheat was real. The wheat was real. This raises a simple but critical question. If the system was so chaotic, so profoundly dangerous as the history books claim, why did commerce flourish? Why did towns grow? Why did roads get built? Granaries get filled? And small industries take root, all without a centralized federal monetary authority telling anyone what their money was worth? When you look at the actual banking failure rates, the official narrative begins to fracture. When you look at the states with the most robust asset-backed currency systems, states like New York, Indiana, and Louisiana, the record is considerably more stable than Washington ever wanted to admit. Louisiana's banking system in particular was backed by a brilliant combination of specie and commercial assets. It survived massive financial panics that completely crushed older, more centralized institutions. In other states, it was not weaker, it was not more chaotic, it was mathematically more resilient. So why don't we talk about that? The deeper I went into the pre-Civil War monetary record, the more I noticed something strange, something that fundamentally does not fit the narrative of inevitable, necessary reform. What I found was a system, messy, yes, imperfect, certainly, but a system in which financial power was distributed, a system in which a citizen's relationship to money was mediated not by a distant, faceless authority, but by institutions they could, in principle, walk into, argue with, and hold accountable. And then came 1863, then came 1864, then came 1873. Three pieces of legislation, three quiet earthquakes. The National Banking Act of 1863, refined and strengthened in 1864, did several things that sound incredibly administrative and dry. They sound boring, and that is exactly why they were so effective. It created a system of nationally chartered banks. These national banks could issue standardized currency, national banknotes, but only under one highly specific condition. They could only issue money if they purchased United States government bonds and deposited them with the federal comptroller of the currency. Read that again. The currency they then issued was backed not by local assets, not by land, not by grain, not by physical productive wealth. It was backed by government debt. The backing shifted from productive assets to government obligations, from things that existed in the physical world to promises made by the state. And then the state went to war against the old money. But they didn't send soldiers. They sent accountants. A 10% tax was levied on all state banknotes. They were not prohibited outright. They were not declared illegal by dramatic presidential fiat. They were just taxed, incrementally, relentlessly, punishingly, until it was no longer economically viable for any local bank to issue them. This raises a simple but critical question. Why tax rather than ban? If the old currency was genuinely dangerous, if it was truly fraudulent and chaotic and ruining the nation, why not simply outlaw it? Why use the slower, quieter mechanism of taxation to achieve what could have been done by direct prohibition? The answer, I think, lies in what the slower mechanism conceals. A ban is visible. A ban generates immediate resistance. A ban leaves a clear, fiery, historical record of what was lost, who took it, and why. But a tax? A tax looks like fiscal policy. It looks like economic management. It looks like the ordinary, boring business of governance. It was not a prohibition. It was not a seizure. It was not a declaration of war on local monetary sovereignty. It was just a tax. It was just paperwork. And that is where the national banking acts become impossible to ignore. They were a masterclass in erasing a financial system without leaving fingerprints. But the men in Washington weren't finished. Now we come to 1873, the Coinage Act, an act that even some terrified contemporaries eventually called the Crime of 73. The Coinage Act reorganized United States coinage, and in doing so, it quietly, almost invisibly, omitted the standard silver dollar from the list of coins to be minted. Silver had been a legal tender metal since the founding of the Republic, since 1792. For 81 years, silver was money. It was standard, it was constitutional, it was real. And then, in a piece of legislation so dense, so intensely technical, so deliberately difficult to parse that many of the congressmen who voted for it later publicly swore they hadn't understood what it contained. Silver was gone. Here is the strangest part. The omission wasn't announced. It wasn't debated openly on the floor of the House. It was buried, tucked deeply into the technical specifications of coinage weights and chemical compositions, where only those with specific metallurgical expertise or specific foreknowledge would recognize what was actually happening. Who benefits from the demonetization of silver? Silver was abundant in the American West. Silver was accessible. Most importantly, silver was decentralized. You could mine it, refine it, bring it to the mint, and turn it into money. It was a commodity with intrinsic value that existed completely independently of any bank's balance sheet, any government's bond issuance, or any centralized institution's decision to extend or withhold credit. Gold, by contrast, was scarce. Gold was concentrated. Gold was held in massively large quantities by a very small, very elite number of institutions and individuals in New York and London. By fixing the monetary system to gold alone, the effect of the 1873 Act meant fixing the American economy to an asset that only a select few could ever hope to control. Look at the sequence. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. First, tax away the locally issued asset-backed currency. Second, remove the highly accessible commodity metal from legal tender. Third, standardize the entire nation's economy around the remaining assets, government bonds and gold that just so happen to be concentrated in the fewest hands. This was not reform. This was not simplification. This was not modernization. This was consolidation, the greatest consolidation of financial power in the history of the Republic. I want to stop here and ask you something that kept me awake for weeks while researching this. What if this wasn't only an American story? Because the deeper I went into the monetary history of other industrializing nations in the exact same period, the 1860s through the 1880s, the more the exact same pattern repeated with unsettling precision. Britain had already largely centralized its monetary authority through the Bank Charter Act of 1844, also known as Peel's Act. This gave the Bank of England monopoly control over note issuance and rigidly tied the currency to gold. Before that act, private banks throughout England and Scotland issued their own notes. They were backed by their own assets. They were accountable to their own local communities. After 1844, one bank, one note, one standard. And that standard was backed entirely by what the central institution held, not what local communities produced. Then look at Canada. The Dominion Notes Act of 1868, followed instantly by the subsequent banking legislation of the 1870s. It moved aggressively toward federal control of currency issuance, choking out the ability of provincial and private institutions to issue competing notes. Germany. The Reichsbank was established in 1876, consolidating currency issuance from dozens of independent state banks into a single national institution immediately following German unification. Japan. The National Bank Act of 1872. It was modeled explicitly, and I do mean explicitly line for line, on the American National Banking Act of 1864. It created a centralized system that completely replaced the chaotic but locally grounded monetary arrangements of the feudal period. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, country after country, decade after decade, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand, or perhaps instructions they understood very, very well. Within roughly a 30-year window from 1844 to 1876, nearly every major industrializing economy on planet Earth transitioned from distributed, locally issued asset-backed currency systems to centralized, institutionally controlled debt-backed monetary frameworks. The timing is not accidental. It mathematically cannot be accidental. The coordination required across sovereign nations, across competing political systems, across entirely different legal traditions, languages, and cultural contexts. The sheer coordination required for this to be coincidental is simply not available to probability. This is where the official explanation completely collapses. The official textbook story is that each nation independently, rationally, pragmatically decided to modernize its monetary system. That each set of legislators simply looked at their own chaotic local situation and organically concluded that centralization was the only answer. But the simultaneity, the rigid uniformity of the solution, the identical mechanism, tax, regulate, and ultimately eliminate the competing local currency, applied across entirely different global jurisdictions, with no formal coordination mechanism on the public record. That is the anomaly. That is where I keep getting stuck. Let me be incredibly precise about what this global transition actually created. Not what the critics claim, not what the partisans assert. I want to look at what the structural, mathematical mechanics of the new system actually produced. Under the old, locally issued, asset-backed currency system, the creation of money was tied to the creation of value. Remember our farmer in Ohio? The farmer who grew wheat, stored it, and obtained a warehouse receipt that functioned as currency. That farmer had literally expanded the money supply in exact proportion to real, physical, productive output. The money existed because the wheat existed. Under the new system, the government bond-backed national currency, the gold standard centralized issuance, money entered circulation through a fundamentally different, alien mechanism. Banks borrowed from central institutions. Governments issued bonds. Currency was created not from productive assets, but from credit. Credit extended by centralized authorities. And credit, unlike land, unlike grain, unlike stored commodities, must be repaid with interest. Here is what that means structurally. I want you to really think about this. In the old system, a community that produced value could, within limits, create money reflecting that value. The financial system was downstream of the productive system. Money followed productivity. You build something, wealth appears. In the new system, productivity became downstream of finance. You could not build, you could not plant, you could not mine or manufacture without first obtaining credit from a distant institution that determined whether you were creditworthy. The institution didn't follow the economy. The economy was forced to follow the institution. This raises a simple but critical question. If your money comes from debt, if every single dollar in circulation represents an obligation to a lending institution, then is it possible to ever collectively pay off that debt? Think about the math. If the money needed to pay the interest was itself created as debt, where does the interest come from? The answer, mathematically, structurally, unavoidably, is that it can't. Not in aggregate. Some individual borrowers will pay off their debts, sure, but the system, as a whole, the total stock of debt-backed money must perpetually expand just to service itself. More debt is needed to pay. The interest on the existing debt, more credit must be extended, more dependency deepened. This is not a fringe observation. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is basic arithmetic. And that arithmetic, that unyielding structural dependency, is what the Coinage Act of 1873, the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, and their equivalents in Britain, Germany, Canada, and Japan quietly, technically, bureaucratically installed, not with guns, not with declarations of war against the working class, with coinage weights, bond collateral requirements, and a 10% tax. When I started looking for the physical record of what was lost, not the theoretical record, but the tangible surviving evidence of how these locally issued currency systems actually function, I kept running into the exact same problem. The records are incredibly thin. They are not entirely absent. They are not completely erased, but they are thin in a way that feels intensely disproportionate to the massive scale of what once existed. For a period spanning nearly 3 decades of active, widespread local banking, involving thousands of chartered state institutions and millions of individual notes in circulation, the surviving documentation is remarkably, almost artificially sparse. Take some of what we do have, the notes themselves, the ones that miraculously survive in private collections and forgotten museum archives. The designs are extraordinary. I'm looking at an 1850s Ohio banknote bearing an intricate engraving of a canal lock and a local landmark. A Wisconsin note depicting a farmer with a plow, his hands gripping the wood. A Louisiana note incorporating both English and French text, reflecting the true culture of the people who used it. These weren't just money, they were community artifacts. They literally bore the identity of the places that issued them. And then they were taxed out of existence, and most of them were systematically destroyed, not archived, not preserved in federal vaults, as historical records of a bygone era. Destroyed, because a canceled, withdrawn banknote had no value to the new regime. It was paper, it was waste. And so the physical record of what local monetary sovereignty actually looked like, what it felt like to hold in your hand, money that bore the name of your community and the actual physical assets of your neighbors, that record was burned. The silence was deafening. I've spent time digging through local historical societies in Ohio, in Indiana, in rural Georgia. I was looking for the banking records, from the free banking era, the ledgers, the correspondence, the records of what exact physical assets were used as collateral, to back what specific notes. They are patchy, fragmentary, infuriatingly inconsistent. And it's not because the record keeping was poor at the time. By all accounts, many of these local institutions maintain meticulous, beautiful books, but the books simply didn't survive. The transition periods are heavily documented. The establishment of the new national bank charters is perfectly documented. But what came before fragments into dust, as if the paper trail, like the currency itself, was quietly, persistently allowed to disappear. I keep coming back to the global coordination problem, because it is the anomaly I absolutely cannot explain away. 30 years, dozens of sovereign nations, the exact same solution applied to the exact same problem of local monetary autonomy, with the exact same structural result: centralized control, debt-backed currency, and absolute dependency on institutional credit. No international treaty mandated this. There was no United Nations, no global monetary authority to coordinate it. The nations involved were, in many cases, bitter competitive rivals. Britain and Germany were vying for European supremacy. The United States and Britain were still deeply untrusting of one another. Japan was frantically positioning itself against Western imperial powers. They had every political and strategic incentive to diverge, to differentiate, to experiment with different financial weapons. And yet the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The evidence suggests something much larger than a series of independent, rational decisions. It suggests the distinct possibility of a shared framework, a common unspoken set of ideas circulating among the extreme, upper echelon of economic and political elites of all industrializing nations. Ideas about what money should fundamentally be, who should control it, and exactly how that control should be locked into institutions. We know these networks existed. The historical correspondence between American Treasury officials and their British counterparts in the 1860s is public. The explicit modeling of Japanese banking legislation on American precedents is a matter of record. The deep influence of German monetary thinking on American institutional design is well documented. The networks were real. The communication was real. What remains unclear, what the historical record cannot quite resolve, or perhaps what it will not quite resolve, is whether what circulated through those elite networks was merely shared knowledge or something closer to an instruction. Were these legislators and financiers independently reaching similar conclusions from similar premises, or were they receiving, through channels we cannot fully document, something more like a master blueprint? I am not going to tell you which one it is. I don't know for certain, and I am highly suspicious of anyone on the internet who claims they do. But the question I cannot stop asking myself deserves to be asked out loud. What strikes me most in the end is not the legislation itself. It's not the technical mechanisms of bond collateral. It's not even the structural consequences of perpetual debt, as profound and terrifying as those are. What strikes me is the silence, the transition from distributed, locally rooted, asset-backed monetary systems to centralized, debt-backed, institutionally controlled currency was, in purely objective terms, one of the most significant world-altering reorganizations of economic power in the history of human civilization. It fundamentally altered the relationship between ordinary human beings and the institutions that govern their very survival. It shifted the locus of monetary creation from the community to the institution, from tangible productivity to invisible credit, from the real to the obligatory, and it happened with almost zero genuine public debate about what was actually at stake. There were critics, of course. The free silver movement in the 1870s and 1880s understood, at least intuitively in their guts, that something fundamental had been stolen from them. The Greenback Labor Party understood. The agrarian populace who followed them understood. When William Jennings Bryan stood before the 1896 Democratic Convention and thundered his famous speech, he didn't choose the metaphor of crucifixion on a cross of gold by accident. He knew, or he deeply sensed, that something vital had been killed. But the debate, when it finally happened, was successfully framed in highly technical terms by the elite. Sound money versus cheap money, gold versus silver, inflation versus deflation. The deeper question, who controls the creation of money and on what basis, and to whose exact benefit? That question never quite made it to the center of public discourse. It was framed out, technically, deliberately. I cannot prove deliberately in a court of law, but the framing serves certain centralized interests with an uncanny, flawless consistency. The deeper I went, the more that consistency became impossible to ignore. Within 20 years of the National Banking Acts, by the 1880s, the agricultural regions of America were experiencing a devastating credit crisis. Farmers who had operated, however imperfectly, within a locally mediated financial system suddenly found themselves completely dependent on distant eastern banks for seasonal credit. That credit came with terms they didn't set, interest rates they couldn't negotiate, and collateral requirements that increasingly meant signing away their land. The massive foreclosure wave of the late 19th century, which drove the agrarian political movements, which produced the Populist Party, which generated decades of rural political fury, that wave was not simply the result of bad harvests or falling commodity prices, though those contributed. It was structurally the result of the transition. It was the result of a system in which the money supply was now controlled by centralized institutions whose incentives were completely unaligned with agricultural productivity, whose credit allocation decisions were made in high-rises in eastern cities, whose bond collateral requirements meant that currency availability tracked the government's debt rather than a community's seasonal physical need. It was not the weather. It was not individual improvidence. It was not market forces operating. In some neutral, invisible way, it was the structure, the deliberately, legislatively constructed structure. And that structure persists right now as you watch this. The mechanisms have changed. The names of the acts have changed. The institutional sophistication has evolved enormously into digital ledgers and quantitative easing. But the fundamental relationship in which currency is created through institutional credit extension rather than through productive asset backing, in which the money supply